Dawn breaks over the highlands of northern Ethiopia, and the mist has not yet lifted from the valleys around a small town called Adwa. It is the first day of March, 1896. Somewhere below, tens of thousands of men are waking on cold ground, wrapped in chamois stained with the dust of a 100-mile march. Cook fires flicker between the rocks. A horse snorts. A rifle bolt slides home somewhere in the dark, and the sound travels farther than it should. On one side of this valley wait the soldiers of Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia. Farmers, nobles, priests, and warriors, drawn from every province of an ancient empire, carrying rifles bought and bartered across 3 continents. Many have walked for weeks to be here. Some carry spears passed down from grandfathers. Others carry the newest European weapons available. Among them, on a mule and later on horseback, moves a woman who has organized supply lines, negotiated with generals, and refused, again and again, to let her husband's kingdom bend. On the far ridge, an Italian army waits for the order to advance. Young conscripts from Naples and Piedmont, officers trained in the academies of a newly unified European nation Hungary to prove itself equal to Britain and France. They believe, as their commanders have told them, that they face a disorganized native force that will scatter at the first volley. They believe they are bringing civilization to a backward land. They are wrong on almost every count, and within a matter of hours, the world will know it. By the time the sun is high over Adwa, one of the most consequential battles of the 19th century will be over. An African army will have inflicted a defeat on a European colonial power so total, so undeniable, that it will stop an invasion in its tracks and force an empire to sue for peace. It will become a name spoken with pride across a continent still being carved up by foreign powers, and a name European chancelleries would rather forget. This is the story of how that morning came to be, and why, more than a century later, the Battle of Adwa still matters. By the end of the 19th century, the map of Africa had been almost entirely redrawn by men who had never set foot on the continent. In conference rooms in Berlin, diplomats representing Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and Belgium had drawn borders across rivers and mountains they knew only from surveys, dividing a continent of hundreds of nations and millions of people according to the interests of European capitals. By 1896, only 2 states in Africa remained free of colonial control. Liberia, a fragile republic founded by freed American slaves, and Ethiopia, an ancient highland empire whose roots stretched back more than 1,000 years. Ethiopia's independence was not an accident, and it was not guaranteed. It was defended deliberately, strategically, and, at enormous cost, at a place called Adwa. The battle fought there was not simply a clash of armies. It was a test of whether the momentum of European colonization could be halted by an African state fighting on its own terms, with its own leadership, its own diplomacy, and its own vision of modernity. Ethiopia's victory answered that question in a way that reverberated far beyond the Horn of Africa, reaching the ears of anti-colonial movements from the Caribbean to South Africa to the United States. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to the ambitions of a young European nation looking for a place among empires, and to the extraordinary rulers of Ethiopia who understood, better than almost anyone in Africa at that time, how to survive in a world being remade by conquest. The final decades of the 19th century are often remembered as the scramble for Africa, a period in which European powers, driven by industrial ambition, nationalist pride, and competition with one another, rushed to claim territory across the continent. Railways, rubber, gold, and strategic ports along trade routes to Asia all made African land valuable in the eyes of European governments. Between 1881 and the early 1900s, the vast majority of the continent came under some form of colonial rule, often imposed through a combination of unequal treaties, manufactured pretexts, and outright military force. Ethiopia stood apart from this pattern for several reasons. It was not a stateless region waiting to be organized by outsiders, as colonial propaganda often claimed of African territories. It was a centralized, historically continuous monarchy with its own written language, its own Orthodox Christian church tracing back over a millennium, its own systems of law, taxation, and regional governance, and a long tradition of military organization forged through centuries of conflict with neighboring states and internal rivals. Ethiopia's highland geography, steep plateaus, deep gorges, and a climate that could be brutal to outsiders unfamiliar with it, had also long served as a natural defense against invasion. But geography and history alone do not explain Ethiopia's survival. What made the difference in the 1890s was leadership, a ruler capable of unifying fractious regional lords under a single crown, modernizing the country's military capacity, and playing European powers against one another diplomatically, even while preparing for the possibility that diplomacy would fail. That ruler was Menelik too, and the story of Adwa cannot be told without first understanding the man who prepared Ethiopia for this moment years before the first shots were fired. Italy in the late 19th century was a young nation with an old inferiority complex. Unified only in 1861 from a patchwork of kingdoms and city-states, the new Italian government was acutely aware that it lagged behind Britain, France, and even Germany in industrial power, military reputation, and colonial holdings. For Italian nationalists and monarchists alike, an empire was not simply an economic project. It was proof of arrival, a way of telling the rest of Europe that Italy belonged among the great powers. The Horn of Africa offered an opening. Italy had already established a foothold on the Red Sea coast, at the port of Massawa, and through the 1880s it steadily expanded its colonial territory of Eritrea inland from that base. Italian strategists increasingly viewed the Ethiopian highlands to the south not as a sovereign neighbor, but as a natural next step, a region to be absorbed, formally or informally, into an expanding Italian sphere of influence. Central to Italy's ambitions was a document signed in 1889, the Treaty of Ethiopia. Negotiated with Emperor Menelik shortly after he had consolidated power, the treaty was intended by Ethiopia to establish friendly relations and a border understanding with Italy. But the two-language versions of the treaty, one in Amharic, one in Italian, did not say the same thing. In the Italian language text, a clause implied that Ethiopia had agreed to conduct all its foreign relations through Italy, effectively reducing the empire to an Italian protectorate. The Amharic version made no such concession. Whether this discrepancy was the result of deliberate manipulation or careless translation remains debated by historians, but its consequences were not ambiguous. When Italy began presenting Ethiopia to other European powers as a protectorate under its authority, Menelik and his court recognized the danger immediately. Italian planners, meanwhile, badly misjudged what they were dealing with. Influenced by racial assumptions common across colonial Europe at the time, many Italian officers and officials expected an Ethiopian army to be poorly armed, poorly organized, and unable to withstand a modern European force in open battle. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong, but it shaped Italian strategy at every stage in the years leading up to 1896, from the confidence with which Italy pushed its claims to the overreach of its final advance toward Adwa. Menelik was not a man who had inherited his throne easily. Born in 1844 as a regional prince, he spent years as a hostage of a rival emperor before escaping and rebuilding his base of power in the central Ethiopian region of Shua. Through a combination of military campaigns, careful marriages, and shrewd alliances with regional nobility, he expanded his personal domain for decades before finally securing the imperial crown in 1889, the same year the Treaty of Ethiopia was signed. What set Menelik apart from many contemporaries, both Ethiopian rivals and European observers who underestimated him, was his approach to modernization. He was deeply pragmatic about incorporating tools of the industrial age into Ethiopian statecraft. He imported modern rifles and artillery through a variety of channels, including, at times, from the very European powers competing for influence over his territory. He invested in early infrastructure and communication. He understood, with unusual clarity for a monarch of his era, that Ethiopia's survival depended on being taken seriously as a modern state, not dismissed as a target for conquest. Diplomatically, Menelik played a careful and often ruthless game. He corresponded with France, Britain, and Russia, each of which had its own reasons to see Italian ambitions in the Horn of Africa checked or encouraged, depending on their rival interests. He used these relationships to acquire weapons and information while resisting Italy's attempts to isolate Ethiopia diplomatically. When Italy began publicly asserting a protectorate over Ethiopia based on its version of the Untold Treaty, Menelik responded not with panic, but with a formal, documented rejection of the claim, sent to the courts of Europe, denouncing the Italian interpretation and asserting Ethiopia's full sovereignty. He was not a flawless figure. His consolidation of power involved brutal campaigns against rival Ethiopian regions, and the empire he ruled was itself a complex, sometimes coercive union of diverse peoples and kingdoms, not the tidy nation-state of modern imagination. But in the specific crisis facing Ethiopia in the mid-1890s, Menelik's combination of political intelligence, military preparation, and diplomatic patience proved to be exactly what the moment required. If Menelik provided Ethiopia's strategic vision, Empress Taytu Betul provided much of its resolve. Taytu was no ceremonial consort. Born into a powerful noble family with deep roots in the Ethiopian aristocracy, she brought her own political networks, wealth, and influence in her marriage with Menelik, and she used all three throughout the crisis with Italy. Historical accounts consistently describe Taytu as one of the most forceful voices in the imperial court against any accommodation with Italian claims. Where some advisors favored compromise to avoid war, Taytu is remembered as an uncompromising advocate for Ethiopian sovereignty, deeply suspicious of Italian intentions from the earliest stages of the dispute over the Untold Treaty. Her position was not simply emotional defiance. It reflected a clear-eyed reading of what a protectorate arrangement would ultimately mean for Ethiopian independence. During the military campaign itself, Taytu played a direct and active role. She helped organize logistics and provisioning for the enormous Ethiopian force gathering to meet the Italian advance, a force whose sheer size created a monumental supply challenge, feeding and arming tens of thousands of soldiers, along with their families and support personnel, across weeks of movement through difficult terrain. She is also remembered for her involvement in strategic discussions at the highest level, including debates over how and where to engage the Italian army. Her presence at the front was not symbolic. It was a testament to how thoroughly Ethiopia's leadership treated this war as a matter for the entire royal household, not the emperor alone. To tell the story of Adwa without Taytu is to tell only half the story. She stands alongside Menelik, not as a supporting figure in his narrative, but as a central architect of Ethiopia's resistance in her own right. Diplomacy between Ethiopia and Italy deteriorated steadily through the early 1890s. Menelik's formal repudiation of the Italian protectorate claim, sent to European governments, embarrassed Italy internationally and hardened positions on both sides. Italian colonial administrators in Eritrea continued to expand their presence southward, establishing garrisons and alliances with local rulers in ways that Ethiopia read as encroachment on its sovereignty. Both sides used the intervening years to prepare militarily, even as diplomatic notes continued to pass between Addis Ababa and Rome. By 1895, Italian forces under General Oris Baratieri had pushed further into Ethiopian claimed territory, occupying the region of Tigray in the country's north. Menelik responded with what may be the single most important logistical achievement of his reign, a general mobilization that drew fighting men from every corner of the empire, from the northern highlands to the southern provinces, uniting regional lords who had at times been political rivals into a single national war effort against a common external threat. Historians estimate the resulting Ethiopian force at well over 100,000 men, an army whose scale caught Italian intelligence completely by surprise. In Rome, meanwhile, political pressure was building in the opposite direction. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, a committed champion of Italian colonial expansion, pushed for a decisive military solution, dismissing the difficulties his generals reported and demanding a swift victory that would settle the question of Ethiopian sovereignty once and for all. General Baratieri, who understood the risks of overextension better than his political masters in Rome, found himself caught between his own tactical caution and mounting pressure to attack. In the final days of February 1896, that pressure won out. Baratieri ordered his forces into a night march intended to seize favorable high ground before the Ethiopian army could react. It was a plan built on faulty maps, poor reconnaissance, and dangerously optimistic assumptions about Ethiopian capabilities. Within hours, it would come apart entirely. The Italian night march toward Adwa on the last day of February split into separate columns, moving through unfamiliar, broken terrain and darkness. Maps proved unreliable. Units lost contact with one another. By the time dawn broke on the 1st of March, several Italian brigades found themselves dangerously separated, exposed on open ground rather than the defensible high positions their commanders had intended to reach. Ethiopian scouts and forward units detected the Italian movements early, and Menelik's forces reacted with a speed that stunned Italian commanders who had assumed no such coordination was possible. Wave after wave of Ethiopian infantry, supported by cavalry and, in places, modern artillery, converged on the isolated Italian brigades before they could regroup. The Italian center, under General Giuseppe Armandi, held for a period under intense pressure, but with reinforcements unable to reach them in time, the line began to collapse under the sheer weight of Ethiopian numbers and the accuracy of their rifle fire. Many of these weapons, ironically, purchased through the very international arms markets that European powers themselves participated in. By midday, what had begun as a contained engagement had become a rout. Italian units that attempted organized retreat found themselves pursued through terrain that offered little cover and few clear paths of withdrawal. Command and communication between separated Italian brigades broke down almost entirely, turning a difficult tactical position into a catastrophic one. General Baratieri, watching his carefully planned advance disintegrate, could do little to reverse the momentum of the battle once it had turned. The human cost was severe on both sides, but overwhelmingly so for the Italian force. Historians estimate that thousands of Italian and Allied Eritrean soldiers were killed, with thousands more wounded or taken prisoner, losses representing a substantial portion of the entire invading army. Ethiopian casualties, while also significant given the scale of the fighting, were proportionally far lower, and Menelik's forces retained the field entirely. What made the Ethiopian victory possible was not simply numerical superiority, though that mattered. It was the combination of unified command under Menelik, effective use of terrain and local knowledge, a supply and mobilization system organized well in advance of battle, and the accumulated years of diplomatic and military preparation that had allowed Ethiopia to arm itself competitively rather than relying on outdated weaponry. Adwa was not a spontaneous uprising meeting an advanced army by accident. It was the result of a state that had spent years preparing, under leadership that understood exactly what was at stake. News of the Italian defeat reached Rome within days, and the shock was immediate and profound. The scale of the loss, one of the worst defeats suffered by any European colonial power in Africa during the entire era of the scramble, triggered a political crisis. Prime Minister Crispy, who had pushed so forcefully for military action, was forced to resign within weeks as public outrage over the disaster consumed his government. Italy had no choice but to negotiate. In the Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed later in 1896, Italy formally recognized Ethiopia's full and unconditional independence, abandoning any claim to a protectorate and effectively nullifying the disputed clause of the earlier Wuchel Agreement that had triggered the conflict in the first place. For an African state to force a European power into such an explicit, formal reversal was, at that point in colonial history, essentially unprecedented. Across Europe, the defeat forced an uncomfortable reassessment. Colonial officials and journalists who had confidently predicted an easy Italian victory now had to explain how an African army had defeated a modern European force so decisively. Some responded with denial or minimization. Others quietly recognized that assumptions about African military capability needed revision, even if that recognition rarely translated into changed colonial policy elsewhere on the continent. Beyond Europe, the impact was different in character and, in many ways, deeper and longer lasting. News of Adwa spread through African diaspora communities, anti-colonial networks, and black intellectual circles across the Atlantic world, becoming a powerful symbol that European conquest was not an inevitable, unstoppable force. Ethiopia's victory offered proof, at a moment when such proof was rare, that an African nation could meet European military power on its own terms and prevail. More than a century later, The Battle of Adwa remains one of the defining moments in African history, and its significance extends well beyond the specific dispute between Ethiopia and Italy that triggered it. For Ethiopia, Adwa became a cornerstone of national identity, a historical anchor point demonstrating the country's unbroken sovereignty at a time when almost every other African nation was living under some form of colonial rule. For the wider African continent and its diaspora, Adwa's meaning grew larger still. Throughout the 20th century, as anti-colonial and independence movements gathered strength from West Africa to the Caribbean to the American South, Ethiopia's victory at Adwa was frequently invoked as evidence, symbolic and historical both, that colonial domination was neither natural nor permanent. Pan-Africanist thinkers and organizations across the century looked to Ethiopia's example as proof of what independent African self-determination could achieve when circumstances, leadership, and preparation aligned. It is worth resisting the temptation to flatten this history into a simple story of good defeating evil, or Africa defeating Europe as monolithic blocks. What actually happened at Adwa was more specific, and in some ways more instructive. A particular state, led by particular individuals who understood diplomacy, military organization, and the stakes of the moment with unusual clarity, made the deliberate choices necessary to defend its sovereignty, and succeeded where so many others, facing similar pressures under less favorable circumstances, did not. Menelik II and Taytu Betul are remembered today not as flawless icons, but as complex historical figures who navigated an extraordinarily difficult moment with intelligence, resolve, and no guarantee of success. Their victory at Adwa did not end the era of European colonialism in Africa, and it did not resolve every internal contradiction of the Ethiopian state they governed. But it did something that history rarely allows. It proved, at the height of empire, that the outcome was never as inevitable as the empires themselves believed. That, in the end, is why Adwa still matters. Not simply as a battle won, but as a reminder that the map of history is drawn by choices, not by destiny, and that on a single morning in 1896, in a valley in the Ethiopian highlands, that lesson was written for the world to see.